Boa tarde, good afternoon for everyone. I was speaking in Portuguese to Miguel Oliveira just before this, so I have to tell myself now to speak English. Have the beautiful coast of Maceió, Brazil in my background, which is where I would rather be than in Massachusetts right now. This is going to be a series of lectures about a number of topics which I hope will come across as cohesive and related. I've titled this "In Search of Strange Things." It is, and I'll go into more detail as we get into the slides about the nature of the course and what we'll be covering. This is just the first lecture today, and it's going to consist of historical and empirical preliminaries because the course is fairly ambitious, and it will be very tightly connected to a new book that I'm writing entitled Persian Linguistics, a chapter in the history of realist thought. There are a lot of things we don't know. You take this wonderful structure. This structure was built about 200 AD in central Mexico, and the name of the city that this structure sits in is Teotihuacan, and this is the Pyramid of the Sun. But that name was given to it in about 1000 AD, almost 800 years after it was constructed. And the Teotihuacan people built their own pyramid. So this pyramid was built 200 AD, which is roughly 1,200 years after the Aguada Phoenix pyramid of the Mayans. But as many, we've studied these pyramids of Teotihuacan for literally for centuries. The Aztecs looked at them. But no one knows who these people are. No one really knows who the Teotihuacanos were with any certainty. Nobody knows who built these pyramids. The Pyramid of the Sun is, I believe, the second largest pyramid in the world after the Great Pyramid of Giza. I've been told that if you weighed the material in the Pyramid of the Sun, it would actually weigh more than the material in the Pyramid of Giza. But the Teotihuacan people have occupied historians and archaeologists for centuries, yet we still have no answer. And there are many things that we don't know about language still, including even how to define language. There are also many myths about how modern linguistics originated, what it has accomplished, and the validity of its pre-analytic decisions. But to those who spend their lives looking for the novel, the particular, and the strange in human culture and language, we all know that we know very little. This course is as much about things we don't understand as about things we do understand. So let's start off with a quote from a linguist that I'm sure most of you have heard of, Louis Hjelmslev, from his book Language and Introduction. Never perhaps has linguistics passed through a critical period of such profundity and scope as in our time. The very nature of language and its structural peculiarities are now being debated. This concern with foundations has already taken us so far from earlier notions that the new linguistics of our time can be contrasted to all former varieties, which can be grouped together under the common name of classical linguistics. Sooner or later, the present crisis must necessarily lead to a new classicism. Such a crisis is not to be deplored, quite the contrary. Critical periods are proving that science is not stagnant, but is constantly renewing itself. And there's some respects in which the controversy that Hjelmslev was talking about in 1970 has passed. It was, at least the English translation was 1970, and that we are now in a new classical period that perhaps we want to challenge all over again. So the purpose of this course is to indirectly, at least, address Hjelmslev's crisis, the notion of crisis in science and in linguistics in particular. I want to introduce over the course of these lectures, the ideas of Charles Sanders Peirce, especially his semiotics and his existential graphs, as well as other work relevant to linguistics. Peirce was the person who introduced into linguistics, although this is usually not known, into linguistics and philosophy, the concept of type versus token, the concept of valency, which is his own term, and the concept that no verb can have a valency greater than 3, which he derived from his reduction theorem almost 100 years ago, actually well over 100 years ago. He developed existential graphs, which are the analysis of discourse and are logically isomorphic to the discourse representation theory of Hans Kamp and others that developed 80 years afterwards. Peirce was the first American to talk about universal grammar with recursion, and he spent a lot of time working on semantic rather than syntactic recursion. We also want to review the goals of modern formal linguistics and evaluate whether these goals have been or can be met. We want to discuss the relevance of context and linguistic analysis, linguistic context, cultural and immediate contexts. We want to establish the importance of discourse and understanding sentential syntax, and to discuss again Peirce's existential graphs as the original discourse representation theory. To establish the importance of field research as defined in a book that Jeanette Sokol and I published in the Cambridge University Press Red series on linguistic fieldwork. We want to establish the importance of this fieldwork in the philosophy and theory of language. And we want to discuss the implications of two models of formal linguistics, the Peircean model versus all the rest. What are the goals of modern linguistics? Well, broadly speaking, they're simple: to study language. But then what is language? In his early work, Chomsky defined language as a set of sentences. I will consider a language to be a set, finite or infinite, of sentences, each finite in length and constructed out of a finite set of elements. All natural languages in their spoken or written form are languages in this sense. The fundamental aim in the linguistic analysis of a language L is to separate the grammatical sentences of L from the ungrammatical sequences, which are not sentences of L. The grammar of L will thus be a device that generates all of the grammatical sentences of L and none of the ungrammatical ones. And we all know, after many years of reading Chomsky, that when he says generate, he means assign structures to. And this can be generalized to a very strong condition if we insist that the clear cases be handled properly for each language by grammars, all of which are constructed by the same method. So that's a very bold, very clear, very interesting definition of what a language is. There are other definitions, so I'll give you my own, which is far less satisfying in some ways because it's so short and doesn't talk about grammar or anything like that. So communication, what's the relationship between communication and language? All animals communicate, only humans have language. Communication is the transfer of information by signs in the Peircean sense, not in the Saussurean sense. When I talk about semiotics and signs in this course, I'm exclusively referring to Peirce's triadic semiotics and paying very little attention to Saussure's dyadic semiotics. Language is the transfer of information by symbols. So that seems like a simplistic definition, and we don't even know what symbols are yet in Peirce's terms. For Saussure, symbol was just another word for sign. It really didn't have any special status. But for Peirce, symbols have a very special meaning, and we'll talk about that in a future lecture. What is formal linguistics? There are a couple of different definitions of what formal linguistics is. It is linguistics that places form rather than meaning as the principal explanda and explanans. So this formal linguistics is often taken to mean rigorous mathematically based linguistics, and it certainly can be that, but not all mathematically rigorous theories of language are formal in the sense that their primary goal is to understand form as opposed to meaning. Non-formal linguistics can still be formally rigorous and generative in the sense of providing explicit, testable statements, but their principal explananda will not be form. There are many varieties of formal linguistics, but the majority, especially those in the Chomskyan tradition, are sentence-bound and non-constructional. And I will argue in the course of the course that these are severe shortcomings. There is a view that in 1956, September 11th to be exact, which would be a very nice September 11th, 9/11, 1956 is very different from 9/11, 2001, that there was a cognitive revolution that occurred on that very date. And we're going to talk about that. That's actually a founding myth. It's no more true to say that there was a cognitive revolution in September of 1956 than that George Washington chopped down a cherry tree and told his father, "I cannot tell a lie." This is just a myth we tell ourselves in the history of linguistics. And we'll get into why Peirce's work was some of the earliest work in the world in cognitive science. So at this, there was a conference at MIT in September 11th, 1956, and there were many invited speakers. One of the invited speakers was Zelig Harris, who we'll hear more of. Zelig Harris wasn't going to be able to make the meeting, so he sent instead his student, Noam Chomsky, to present a paper, who presented a paper on transformational analysis. George Miller, one of the great psychologists, cognitive scientists of the 20th century, talked about memory. Victor Ingve, who had hired Chomsky to work at MIT initially, gave a paper on statistical hard science. That's his term. Herbert Simon and Alan Newell gave a paper on computational modeling of reasoning and thinking. And Chomsky, in a sense, talked about rules in the mind. I grew up not hearing much about the cognitive revolution in my part of Southern California until I got into college. But there was one thing that I did hear that occurred 2 days before the conference at MIT on September 11th, which was the first appearance of Elvis Presley on national television on the Ed Sullivan Show, just 2 days before the Cognitive Revolution Conference. The only reason I mention that, besides the fact that I like Elvis Presley, is that it sort of contextualizes when all this was happening in the cultural history of the US. Miller's lessons from Chomsky from that conference and subsequently are that language is about mental rules. The idea that psychology studies behavior is equivalent to the idea that physics studies meter reading. That's Miller's own statement. Of course, we know that physicists do in fact study and rely on meters. Understanding the measurements is the first step to understanding why the measurements vary under different circumstances. So that's not a completely fair quote, but good enough. I mean, this was a reaction to the work of B.F. Skinner in behaviorism. And that is all part of the founding myth of the cognitive revolution. We could say that there was both a linguistic revolution and a cognitive revolution at this time. And in fact, some people do say that. In the linguistic revolution, part of what we were supposed to be seeing for the first time is rigor in constituent analysis and the consequences of notation, moving away from the discursive style of the humanities. But this is still not a revolution, and it wasn't a revolution at the time, since Charles Hockett and Leonard Bloomfield were also engaged in this in mathematical linguistics, as was Gleason to a lesser extent. So there was a lot of work in mathematical linguistics being done about this time. Chomsky's logical structure of linguistic theory was one of those, maybe even the best. But one of the reasons for this is this was the time of growing interest in computers and mathematical bases for the understanding and analysis of human behavior and human language. But there are many senses in which the so-called linguistic revolution that occurred in the 50s was a continuation of the Bloomfieldian program in his book Language 1933, concerned with the structure of sentences. There's no sense in which this was a cognitive revolution that took place in 1956. So we had, in the 40s, we had the work of Nikolai Trubetskoy and Roman Jakobson and the Prague Circle. In 1921 in the USA, Sapir was working on cognition, very interested in that. And Worf is probably the most famous so-called cognitive science of the 20s and 30s. There's an interesting correspondence between my first linguistics professor, Kenneth Lee Pike, and Edward Sapir, who was an advisor to Pike. Sapir tried to get Pike to do his PhD with him at Yale. Bloomfield tried to get Pike to do his PhD with him at Chicago. But Pike chose to do his PhD at Michigan because he was more interested in applied linguistics. In any case, in the 40s, actually in the 30s, because Sapir died in 1939, in the early 30s to mid 30s, Ken Pike was working with Mies-Tech tone analysis, and he couldn't figure out the tones. He was facing what we know today as the distinction between registered tones and contour tones. So he wrote a long letter to Edward Sapir, which is in the SIL archives in, I believe, Dallas, Texas, asking, laying out the facts for Sapir and asking Sapir for his advice. And Sapir said, what may be important that you're not looking at is not the endpoints of the tones, but the speaker's perceptions of the tone's movements. So Pike considered this a great breakthrough because he had only been thinking about level tones, high, mid, low. And when he started to think that tones could be rising or falling based on the perceptions of the speakers, he considered this a great breakthrough. But of course, that's a psycholinguistic insight. What this was, what we saw in some respects, was less a revolution than greater momentum and numbers joining up, along with the addition of psychology and computer science to the linguistic effort. We also have works like Jerome Bruner's 1947 Value and Need as Organizing Factors in Perception, which is one of the earliest works after Peirce in cognitive sciences. We have the Rimrock studies in anthropology in 1948, which were looking at values and people's understanding of their culture in terms of what led to componential analysis and semantics. So a lot of there are two reasons why there was no cognitive revolution. First, people were doing serious cognitive science, and we're going to see much more about Peirce and how he was doing it, even 100 years before then. And second, because behaviorism is alive and well. There's no sense in which behaviorism was ever vanquished. There's the American Behavioral Association, or Association for Behavioral Analysis, ABA, has meetings every year, and they have a lecture called the annual B.F. Skinner Lecture. And I gave that lecture several years ago to over 1,000 people who were, big fans of B.F. Skinner, in the sense that they think that there was no serious demolition of his ideas, and that those ideas still work. So I'm not defending that. I'm simply saying that there are many very intelligent people who don't consider that there was any major destruction of behaviorism. And there are a lot of books called The New Behaviorism, but I don't want to be seen as defending behaviorism. I'm not. I'm just simply saying that it was never vanquished. Most importantly, Peirce's 19th century works in psychology. He was the first experimental psychologist in the US, and only shortly after William Wundt did the first experimental psychology in Germany, Peirce was still independently working on that, on quantitative, interesting experiments in the US. Peirce talked about universal grammar. He talked about meaning, reasoning, existential graphs. These were all about the mind. Existential graphs to Peirce were a moving picture of thinking. That's what they were developed for. Peirce also invented first and second order logic. About the same time in Germany, Gottlieb Frege was also inventing logic, first and second order logic. But Peirce was the first one to develop a theory of quantifiers, existential and universal quantification in first order logic, and his notation was much easier. The great mathematician Peano took Peirce's work in logic and made a couple of changes, simply substituting different symbols for the existential and universal quantifiers. Peirce had his own symbols, and Peano's slight tweaking of Peirce's logic then became the basis of Principia Mathematica, that was the great attempt to derive mathematics from logic by Whitehead and Russell. But even though Russell talked more about Frege, he used Peirce's notation. So again, the inappropriateness of the cognitive revolution metaphor. No one was vanquished, certainly not B.F. Skinner. No battle was undertaken, but lots of exciting new research was begun. Steve Pinker summarizes the cognitive revolution as, with the following sentences: the mental world can be grounded in the physical world by concepts of information, computation, and feedback. The mind cannot be a blank slate because blank slates don't do anything. An infinite range of behavior can be generated by finite combinatorial programs of the mind. Just none of this was new, really, but this is what Pinker thinks was new. Universal mental mechanisms can underlie superficial variation across cultures. The mind is a complex system composed of many interacting parts. To this, I would add at least three more components. A solution space is necessary for any learner. This is something that most cognitive sciences would agree to. And that solution space can be an instinct in the biological sense, a priori in a non-biological sense, or logical. Any simple nature versus nurture dichotomy is wrong, and focus on the learner's job in learning specific and general tasks is crucial. There have been many different views on how language, culture, and cognition relate, and we're going to be talking about these a lot in this course. So let me give you a chart that I proposed. This doesn't look at all three at once, it just looks at them pairwise. So the idea that cognition severely constrains grammar is represented today in Chomsky's universal grammar. The idea that grammar severely restrains cognition is in Worf's linguistic relativity hypothesis. The idea that cognition severely constrains culture can be found in the work of Brent Berlin and Paul Kay on color terms. The idea that grammar severely constrains culture can be found in the work of anthropologist Greg Urban on discourse-centered cultures. The idea that culture constrains cognition is the long-term effects of thinking on cultural restrictions on certain behaviors. And so that would fall broadly under psychology, no specific theory. And culture affecting grammar, that's what I have called for many years ethnogrammar, where individual forms and grammars are structured by culture. The one unfortunate side effect of the so-called cognitive revolution of 1956 was the reification of the study of language. Not everybody would think these are problems. I think they're advantages, but I'll try in the development of the course to convince you that these are problems. A reasonable, howbeit empirically pregnant idealization comes from Chomsky. It's a very famous one. Linguistic theory is concerned primarily with an ideal speaker-listener in a completely homogeneous speech community who knows its language perfectly and is unaffected by such grammatically irrelevant conditions as memory limitations, distractions, shifts of attention and interest, and errors, random or characteristic, in applying his knowledge of language and actual performance. So this is the basis of the competence performance distinction, which was influenced by, but is not identical to, Saussure's langue parole distinction. We face this all the time when we teach students. We want to know what their competence is in a particular material, but we can only get at that by looking at their performance, say on an exam or a paper. So performance is the key to unlocking competence, but when you unlock it, is there anything else there? This is something else we'll want to talk about as we go along. There's also a reification of language by nativism, the idea that language is innate, so that language, by which Chomsky means the I language, internalized language of an individual speaker, is not to be understood as part of human behavior. It's part of human knowledge. And in this characterization of linguistics, to quote Robert May in his MIT doctoral dissertation on logical form many years ago, language is an epistemological enterprise. Grammar is specifically constrained by the genome. And there are other interactions with nature, of course, but severely constrained by the genome. There's subsidiary reification of the study of language. Language, one claim, is not for communication. In his New York Review of Books discussion of the Chomskyan revolution in linguistics of about 50 years ago, John Searle, philosopher John Searle, said this is perhaps the most peculiar of Chomsky's statements, that language is not for communication. Another reification, one which I'm going to criticize severely, is that there is a start symbol which for grammars begin with sentences, and sigma, capital sigma used as a start symbol just means that grammar is about sentences and their components. Performance is not studied. This is questioned by some. I mean, performance is left to sociolinguistics and anthropology and that sort of thing. Context is not studied. The cultural context, discourse context, social, emotional. These things are not part of core grammar, and therefore grammar has been reified to omit these. In general, lack of quantitative methodology, which is ironic given the initial perceptions of formal grammar as mathematical investigations into linguistic structures, the lack of quantitative methodology characterizes most modern formal linguistics, certainly not all, but a great deal of it. But it's important to understand, and this course is not all going to be about metalinguistics. In fact, we're soon to get off that in today. Radical reification is actually essential to the generative syntax enterprise. I-language is not derived from independent factors. It has no logical, mathematical, semantic, phonetic, sociolinguistic, cognitive, cultural, historical, functional, or other basis from which the syntax can be derived synchronically. Pinker and Bloom had an article many years ago arguing that these things might be derived functionally, evolutionarily. Aspects of syntax which are independently derivable from non-grammatical factors should not also be ascribed to the genome. That's just a fact of Occam's razor. Hence, the merge recursion hypothesis must be independent of all these, and this is the crucial hypothesis of a lot of modern formal linguistics, merge in particular to Chomsky's theory. But recursion, which, as I said, and which we'll talk about a bit more in another lecture, was derived by Peirce. Peirce also thought recursion was vital, not form recursion, but meaning recursion. And he derived why it had to be there. He didn't simply say it was there, but he explained why you couldn't have language without recursion. And what Peirce says about recursion is completely compatible with anything I've ever said about recursion. What are some of the consequences of reification? Well, we're unable to account for syntactic phenomena which cross sentence boundaries. So if anybody can identify actual syntactic phenomena which cross sentence boundaries, that's a problem for some theories of formal linguistics. It's unable to account for the influence of sociocultural or other external constraints on grammar. Just to take one example, the effects of altitude and climate on phonology, which has been the subject of a lot of work by Caleb Everett. Since these are physical properties, they're not entirely incompatible with formal linguistics, but they're uncomfortable for formal theories of phonology, the idea that your phonemic inventory and the processes in your language could be affected by what altitude the language developed in is something kind of strange for many phonologists to contemplate. Unable to account for the function and origin of morphosyntactic categories, such as evidentiality and different kinds of constructions, other than to insert an additional tree node. But why do some languages have evidentials and other languages don't? Is this just a fairly trivial distinction between morphology and syntax, or there's something more to it there? Reification of this type also limits us to binary branching endocentric structures. Some of the consequences are that we're unable to account for the architectonic influence of culture or any other external influences on core grammar, such as the work I just mentioned. A particular burden relative to adaptation and natural selection is assumed. Even if the original mutation is exactly as Chomsky said, it has to have an adaptationist story. So let's assume that language just popped into being, merge, for example, the idea that you basically combine things pairwise and in phrases that have heads. Even if that just popped into being, we have to know why it had evolutionary success. Why did that make people fitter? And it had to have done that, or it would not have survived. So we're not escaping the consequences of looking at broader context, even when we propose very narrow grammatical theses. Absence of neurological evidence tends to be ignored. A common response when you ask people where universal grammar is found is, we do not know enough yet about the brain to worry about this. On the other hand, we are learning a great deal about the brain in the work of people such as Evelina Fedorenko and her lab at MIT's Department of Brain and Cognitive Sciences. And we know that according to her work, the brain has adapted for storage in what she calls the language network for meaning or symbols rather than syntax. So we'll look at that. We'll look at her research more in coming courses. So what is the payoff of all of this reification of linguistics that occurred starting in the way back with Sapir, and mainly with Bloomfield and continuing through Chomsky? What is entailed? Any theory that is able to account for what generative linguistics does, plus the things it cannot account for, in principle, is to be preferred. And one could argue that there are such theories: Roland reference grammar, construction grammar, the work of Wally Chafe, Camp's discourse work. I don't really think any of them completely subsume generative grammar. None of these are obvious choices. They're all interesting theories looking at different aspects of language. So I'm not claiming that there is such a theory, but I would claim that there are some that look as though they might be. Certainly, we don't find this kind of reification outside of generative grammar, although we always find idealizations. So here are what I consider to be the original sins of formal linguistics. First is meaning interprets form rather than form interpreting meaning. Second, form is innate rather than general principles such as compositionality and semiotics. Forms are primarily sentence-bound. We are concerned with static synchrony versus dynamic synchrony. In other words, failure to study variation meaningfully. And the role of culture is negligible and primarily concentrated in the lexicon. So we can say all of these things, but the proof is in the pudding. So what's the empirical evidence for any of this stuff? Let's start with real world knowledge and semantic interpretation. So we'll take a pair of sentences like from Jerry Hobbs' work in 1979. John can open Bill's safe. He knows the combination. Okay, we know that he refers to John because we know about the real world that John can open Bill's safe. It doesn't make any sense to say that Bill, the owner of the safe, knows the combination. He could refer to either John or Bill, but it refers to John because of what we know about the world. John can open Bill's safe. He better change the combination. In this case, he refers to Bill because John's not going to be the one to change the combination. The safe's not his. So in pairs of sentences like this, we see that real world knowledge is vital for semantic interpretation. This is going to come back significantly when we talk about interpreting multiple sentence utterances, discourses. And we can say these in sentences: John can open Bill's safe because he knows the combination. We know that he has to be John. John can open Bill's safe, which is why he should change the combination. Again, we know this is Bill. So right away we see that to interpret sentences, we need something more than simple compositionality. That's not going to give us the full meaning of the sentences. We have to know about safes. Somebody who doesn't come from a culture with safes is not going to know how to interpret these sentences. Now, you could say that this is just because they don't know the lexical item, and therefore, if you know the lexical item, the compositionality follows. There are a couple of problems with that, but I won't address them right now. Let's just say that if you have a sentence-bound theory, then it's difficult for you to account for these kinds of pairs of sentences. We also know that in many languages, there are constructions that don't seem to be either words or phrases. And these are what some have called complex predicates or mixed categories. So in Hindi, we have, from the work of Mohanan, we have categories that are multi-headed. They are composed of more than one grammatical element, and are neither word nor phrase. We see the same kind of thing in Persian. So in these examples, the stress facts treat the complex predicate as a single zero-level verb. Persian complex predicates may differ from their simple verb counterparts and argument structure properties, but they undergo derivational processes that are typically restricted to applying to zero-level categories. What this is that you have a couple of words in a row in which, so for example, in the first sentence, Ali hit the man. Hit is a simple verb, but in the second sentence, he hit words. He talked to Babak. And although these are stressed as single words and have other properties of single words, their semantics are of two words. So mixed categories present challenges for formal theories, not severe challenges, but they require some adaptation. So for example, even Andrew Carney in 2000, talking about Irish, says that any given phrase marker may bear properties of both traditional phrases and heads. What limits the behavior of phrase markers are other properties of the human language computation system, not a structural definition or stipulation of its status as a phrase or a head. And the inspiration for Carney's proposal comes from Chomsky's 1995 claim that clitics behave both like phrases and heads. So in Irish, what Carney is arguing is that you can't really distinguish clearly between words and phrases in certain environments. The point of these examples of mixed categories is to help us see that simply the idea of taking something from the lexicon and sticking it into a terminal node in a tree is not going to give us the full answer of what's going on. We have to see how the tree works, and sometimes this exceeds compositionality, and we're going to talk a lot more about compositionality. There's also something called periphrastic morphology. So if we take this example from Udmort, the negative examples are, and I forgot to provide the translation. Anyway, the negative examples are multiple words that function in single morphological slots. And I have written on this extensively in Wadi, an Amazonian language, so that spatial demonstratives, so to say something proximate to here, this in English would be kokwa, masculine singular, something proximate to speaker. Proximate to here, which would be like in Portuguese, aquele. We don't actually have a word for that in English. So, or No, so in Portuguese you would have something like este, esse, aquele. In English we simply have this and that. So proximate to here is coma, and distal is coquine, feminine singular camquat, camma, camquine. All of these multiple words fit in a single morphological paradigm in Wadi. And I have a longish article in the International Journal of American Linguistics where I discuss periphrastic pronouns in Wadi at length and show that these have some properties of words and some properties of multiple words. I won't say phrases, but they're mixed categories, and they don't admit of any particularly simple analysis, not even, as I try to show in that article, not even if we try to extend Kearney's formal syntactic analysis, it doesn't go through for these categories. We also have in Wadi temporal demonstrative pronouns that are periphrastic morphology. So we have something which is seen and not heard. So it's a different kind of, so you might say that this alligator, just because we've heard it, but we haven't seen it yet. Or we might say this alligator in masculine singular, again, going to the middle, kopakarane. This all comes not only from the article in IJL that I published, but also in the large grammar of Wadi that I co-authored with Barbara Kern many years ago from I can't remember the publisher now, but because it changed after we published ours, they changed the series. It was a series edited on descriptive grammars edited by Bernard Comrie. And so recently absent that if the alligator is making a noise and we can't see it, but we can hear it, then we use kopaka. If it's just left, we use kopakarane. And if it's been gone for a long time, we say kopakarapane. But these are all morphological categories filled by phrases. So there is a morphological paradigm, but there aren't individual morphemes in it. There are multiple morphemes, almost phrases. And historically, we can see that they were phrases. Actually, we see similar things in Piraha proper names, which function currently as single words, but historically, we can tell they were phrases. A more interesting category is the intentional state constructions in Wadi, where the predicate is actually an embedded sentence. So the verb-like predicates features of these predicates is that the embedded sentence only occurs in the verb position of the matrix clause. So Wadi is a verb, object, subject language, and that's a fairly strict order. Normally, nothing is allowed in the initial position of the sentence except for the verb. But in this particular kind of construction, which we're going to see examples of, the initial position, which is normally reserved for the verb, doesn't have a verb. It has a sentence, an embedded sentence. And so what makes it seem like a verb as opposed to an embedded sentence is that it occurs in the verb position. Second, the embedded sentence may undergo predicational modification, cliticization, and compounding just like any verb, which is a fairly esoteric kind of behavior for a sentence. You can do all these things to it as though it were just a verbalized, verb, a sentence that has been verbalized and made into a verb. And if that were all there were to it, of course, it would just be a sentence that went from an XP in Chomsky's theory, or actually Zelig-Harris's theory of X-bar theory, and it became an X0. Only the last syllable of the embedded sentence carries primary stress. The stress system of Wadi is fairly similar to French. We stress the last syllable of every word. So when we put the sentence inside the verb category, it's stressed at the end like a single word. There's no other potential predicate or verb in the matrix clause. There's only that sentence. The inflectional clitics must follow the embedded sentence. Normally, they have to follow the verb. What are some of the phrase-like characteristics of these predicates? They have the structure of fully productive clauses or sentences, and they manifest internal WH questions, focus structures, and tree structures typical of clauses and sentences. And they are subject to constraints on reference relative to the main clause, which would otherwise violate the anaphoric island constraint of Postal 1969. Postal said that you couldn't, Paul Postal said you could not refer into a word. Some people dispute that these days, but let's just assume for now that he's right. Well, but you can in these. So if they were verbs, you shouldn't be able to have this interaction, co-referentiality and anaphoric dependencies between this embedded clause or verbalized clause and the main clause, but you can. So look at the quotatives to take one example. Who went to Guajara, which is a town in Hondonia near where the Wari live, said the chief to the woman. So Mako Mao, so that's the embedded sentence, and it's followed by nine, which is a verbal inflectional suffix, normally can only follow a verb, Guajara, and then that whole thing is embedded and followed by another verbal inflectional suffix, and then followed by woman, chief. So verb, object, subject, and it's still verb, object, subject if we see the entire embedded phrase, which ends with Guajara. There's actually two embedded phrases. There's Makomao, and there is then Guajara, and that all means just who went to Guajara. And then there's also Kauchi Karawa Nan Nana Wijima, which is the children will eat food. Literally, we will eat food, the children. So the embedded phrase "we will eat food" is, or "we eat food" is Kau Shi Karawa, followed by Nana, which is the inflectional suffix or inflectional clitic. So notice that there's no verb to say in these sentences. It is implied from the structure. The content of this implied verb appears in the verb position. So if it's not verbalized entirely and it's got the characteristics of both a word and a phrase, here we have a very strange category that doesn't fit. We put into a verb slot something that does not come from the lexicon, something which is itself a productive sentence and not entirely a verb, and yet being treated partially like a verb. We also see this in supposition. There are a number of structures in Wari that have these embedded clauses or sentences inside what we would normally assume to be the verb phrase. So this is not only found, that a detailed discussion of all this is found in the grammar of Wari, but it's also found in a published paper of mine, Wari Intentional State Constructions. And both the pronouns and these intentional state constructions are in a larger paper of mine called Liminal Categories, which is on LingBuzz. So if you know about the LingBuzz site, you can look for liminal categories and read in detail about my analysis of these and why they're problematic for formal theories. There are conditionals, refusals. Each one of these constructions is slightly different in its grammar than the other constructions. So not only do we have this, which is this mixed category of a sentence functioning as a verb, but we have it involved in a number of constructions, each of which has slightly different properties, and it's those properties that give us its function in the grammar: sequentiality. The children ate food. Kakain karawa naihuijima. Then the children ate food, which is literally it. The children ate food. Eat, travel. So you get this complex sentence here: eat, travel, third person masculine, third neuter animal, and that is the verb of the sentence. Then the children ate food. So these, in a sense, these very complex recursive structures that Wari uses are used in lieu of much morphology. Unlike many American Indian languages, Wari has a very simple morphology. Its derivational morphology tends to be more complicated than its inflectional morphology, but they're both relatively simple, whereas it has this extremely complicated recursive use of recursion in the syntax, which is very different from Piraha, which has no recursion in the sentence level, but has a lot of recursion at the discourse level, and yet it has a very, very complicated morphology. So what is has one of the most complex sentence structures I've ever seen in the linguistic literature, while at the same time it has one of the simplest morphological structure. So that's a problem for theories that want to be very precise about what's a word versus what is a phrase. And it goes beyond the solution that Carney proposed of simply having something that is dominated by one level of X being treated one way and something as another level being treated another. These mixed categories present difficulties. Now here's an interesting couple of statements from Zelig-Harris in a 1952 paper in a language called discourse analysis. One can approach discourse analysis from two types of problems, which turn out to be related. The first is the problem of continuing descriptive linguistics beyond the limits of a single sentence at a time. The other is the question of correlating culture and language. So Harris, already back in the 50s, early 50s, when Chomsky was doing his PhD, ostensibly under Harris, but actually as a junior fellow at Harvard, working with Nelson Goodman and Willard Quine, but corresponding a great deal with Harris. Harris is concerned about discourse analysis, and he is concerned about relating culture and language. This is where the idea of transformations came from, is out of Harris's concern with discourse analysis. However, Harris goes on to say that descriptive linguistics generally stops at sentence boundaries. This is not due to any prior decision. So he's taking on the idea that would later become known as the start symbol. Chomsky definitely limited linguistics to sentences. But Harris says the techniques of linguistics were constrained to study any stretch of speech. But it turns out that almost all the results we find within a relatively short stretch we may call a sentence. I somehow have screwed up that quote, but what Harris is basically saying is what we're interested in is found in sentences, and what we find outside of sentences is very different. In fact, I published an article on this called The Sentential Divide in Language and Cognition many years ago, in which I argued for the same position, although I have since concluded that I was mistaken. So there were some really interesting works done on indigenous languages from around the world, in particular from Shipibo, which is one of the very first to look at discourse seriously, paper by James Loriot and Barbara Hollenbeck in 1970. It is the thesis of this paper, however, and this is intended as a direct response to the quote I just gave you from Harris, that linguistics goes beyond the domain of individual sentences, and that explicit statements can be made about the relations across sentence boundaries. These statements make use of formal criteria, and we're going to see much more evidence of this when we're going to have an entire class, well, a large part of a class that focuses on discourse analysis in ways that go beyond even discourse representation theory, for example. There's an article on the New Guinean language, Oksapmin, on cohesion and coherence from 1972. Sentence opening expresses the theme or the point of departure of a discourse, paragraph or sentence. It also provides the mechanism, usually verbal inflection, for expressing the relationship of that sentence to the preceding sentence, or the relationship of a group of sentences, a paragraph, to the preceding group of sentences. Closure expresses the speaker's relationship to the discourse through tense and mood. Now, we all know that we find evidence of discourses in English sentences. I mean, no one would deny this. So subjects tend to be associated with continuing information, cohesion, topic continuity, and objects tend to be associated with new information. But what Marshall Lawrence in this 1972 paper is arguing is that we cannot understand the structure of a sentence, and we cannot even understand, as he goes into it, verb structure, verbal inflection, unless we understand the role of the sentence in the discourse. So this is a very different view that's beginning to emerge, which is that sentences are not only not the largest uh, interesting units of syntax, but they are simply um, building blocks, constituents of discourses. So just as a morpheme is a constituent of a word, and a word is a constituent of a sentence, or phrase, and a phrase of a sentence, and a sentence, then a sentence is a constituent of a paragraph, and a paragraph is a constituent of a discourse, which is a constituent of a conversation. And this goes back as well to the work of Kenneth Pike and his grammatical hierarchy. Um, so we already start to see in the early 50s, and then in the 70s in particular, we start to see a great deal more work done on aspects of discourse structure that affect the way sentences are structured, and also cannot be captured, even though they're formal devices, they can't be captured by sentence level grammars. Some things are considered to be fairly obviously sentence level, though. So take something called antecedent contained deletion, in which a deletion that takes place where we wouldn't otherwise expect it. So we have a sentence like, John washed the dishes and Mary did too. And what we mean by did is wash the dishes. Mary washed the dishes too. John washed the dishes on Tuesday and Mary did too, wash the dishes on Tuesday. And there are various analyses of these. And at first there were serious problems, because to get these to work out was almost led to infinite regresses. Because if you simply reproduced, for example, Mary washed the dishes too, to interpret what was deleted, since it was deleted it's represented in the antecedent, you get led to an infinite regress. So Kohlberg recognized every suspect Beck did, recognized every suspect Beck did, recognized every suspect Beck did. SOG provides a quantifier raising analysis of this that sort of gets out of the infinite regress, and is considered to be a reasonably good solution. Dependency grammars offer other kinds of solutions to antecedent contained deletion. So Bill tried to read every book that Sam did, try to read. But one question that arises is, how is this handled across sentence boundaries? So we say, John washed the dishes. In fact, Mary did too, come to think of it. So this is, one could argue, the same formal problem of antecedent contained deletion, except taking place across sentence boundaries. Part of the failure of formal linguistics is to fail to cross the sentence boundary. So what are some other examples? When we hear something, and this comes from the work of Bart Hollebranche in the book Recursion Across Domains, if we say Malcolm is guilty, the jury knows that, the judge knows that, we're interpreting this together. The compositionality doesn't stop at the level of the sentence. In our review of that book, Ted Gibson and I, constructed these examples. So if you say something like, John says, I have been to the stars, and Bill then says, John said something, I have been to the stars, and you give this to people, and you also give them, John said that I have been to the stars, versus John said that I have been to the sun, all English speakers can interpret the non-embedded clauses and identify the error of, if John says I've been to the moon and Bill reports that John said he'd been to the sun, they can recognize this with or without embedding. Embedding is irrelevant to the ability to process these sentences. So the fact that we can cross sentence boundaries is no evidence for sentence level phenomena, the fact that something takes place within a sentence, because we can reconstruct it as taking place across sentences. So just as antecedent contained deletion, at least sometimes, can occur across sentence boundaries, so can our interpretations. In fact, if we look at information injection, to use the terms of Joe Grimes, the relative speed of information, the degree to which we have embedding or non-embedding, is a reflection of the type of culture and the type of discourse we have. So if we are trying to say something that's very important to us, the information rate often increases. So we might say, sank sub, send help, which is just 4 words, meaning I sank our ship sank a submarine, please send help, or send someone. But when we say it like sank sub, send help, this is called telegraphic speech. It's the way we send telegraphs. We are increasing the information flow by shortening the sentences. And we can, and if you study political speech, such as either the current president-elect of the United States or that other person, you will find that their sentences are broken into smaller portions, and yet the information rate is slower. So political speech is a kind of speech that sort of does the opposite of telegraphic speech. It sounds like everything's been broken into shorter chunks, but whereas normally shorter chunks in English discourse tend to indicate greater information rate, according to Joe Grimes, in political speech, it indicates lesser information rate. So to understand and predict the structure of sentences in English, you have to understand whether you're sending telegraphs or whether you're writing a novel or whether you're giving a political discourse. So all of these cultural facts engage with sentence structure and change it in ways that something that wasn't considering discourse structure or cultural evidence would overlook. We say in our review, note that there is no syntactic bedding in the written form of what Bill says in each discourse. There's no quotation and there's no embedded sentence. The embedded meaning would have to be inferred because it is not present in the presented syntax. Our English participants agreed with the target sentence on 99% of the trials, demonstrating that they obtained the embedded interpretation in spite of the lack of embedded syntax. What this just means is that you can't test a claim as to whether a language has embedding in the syntax or not, based on whether it has embedding in the semantics or not, because even in English, that correlation is non-existent. Now, some things that are not objectives of this course is, I'm not trying to say that all of formal linguistics is wrong. There are a lot of interesting insights. What I am attacking is sentence boundedness and the focus on form over meaning, not the rigor and not all of the analyses. Nobody's trying to throw out honest empirical research nor to denigrate the work of others. This is all, Chomsky was asked early on in his career in an interview in the New Yorker by Ved Mehta, someone who just died, why he attacked people so much in his publications. At that time, Chomsky was known as attacking people, and he said, well, I have to get to the bottom of things, and to get to the bottom of things, we have to show what's wrong with what other people do. So I'm not trying to attack anyone, really, but there are times when it's necessary, before we can start laying a foundation, is to say why we need to lay a new foundation. I think one of the reasons that people have fixated on sentences is that they're like propositions, which logicians have studied for a long time. A proposition is basically just a topic and comment, subject and predicate. It's something that is the first thing that has truth values. Words don't have truth values, but propositions have truth values. So, and propositions very often are encoded in the languages of the world as single sentences. And so I think it's quite natural, since logicians have long been interested in propositions, to focus on single sentences. On the other hand, we know that ever since Aristotle, a lot of logic has focused on multiple propositions, such as syllogisms, and that syllogisms have to be interpreted compositionally as a single kind of unit. And the only way we can understand a syllogism is to go beyond the sentence and the proposition. So what is a sentence? There are various definitions, and we'll talk about some. Are sentences needed to express propositions? According to Peirce, they would not be. So if you see a weather vane turn to the west, it is basically saying that the wind is blowing in that direction. And for Peirce, this would have had all of the ingredients of a proposition, so that sentences are neither necessary nor sufficient to express propositions. And that will depend on something else we're going to see, is that you can have multiple propositions in one sentence and multiple sentences expressing one proposition. Can mappings from propositions to sentences be many one? Can mapping from sentences to propositions be many one? Two propositions in one sentence, two sentences to express one proposition. We'll be looking at these, but the point here is simply to understand that the proposition has had, the logical proposition has had a lot to do with why people focus on sentences. So what are some definitions of sentences? Chomsky's definition is fairly formal: a noun phrase, verb phrase, and then broken down into other rewrite rules. An early definition. This is not what he would say today. In role and reference grammar, the description of a sentence in a particular language is formulated in terms of its logical semantic structure and communicative functions, and the grammatical procedures that are available in language for the expression of these meanings. In other words, in role and reference grammar, it is the form that is interpreting the meaning and not the meaning interpreting the form. Construction grammar sees a sentence as a form of sign. It's, in fact, according to Peirce, it would be a symbol. And this is much closer to Peirce's semiotics. So construction grammar, even though it never really acknowledged a debt to Peirce initially that I know of, certainly I think many people have today, but construction grammar is getting back to the semiotic roots of modern linguistics. Compositionality is something that the brain does, right? So the cortex, one of the jobs of the cerebral cortex is to put things together. It's what a detective uses to solve a crime. You take all the clues and you put them together and you get a solution. It's how you cook something following a recipe. You know, you compose the recipe as you go, and you make this thing, which is actually if you bake a cake, it is the interpretation of the recipe. But there are problems with compositionality, especially people who believe that compositionality is really all there is to what's important in meaning, such as Montague semantics, for example. So if we have something like the doctor imposes a drastic diet, we could say maybe that we start from the bottom and we compose on the way up. We start with drastic diet and imposes a drastic diet, and the doctor imposes, and then we get the meaning of the sentence. But that's going to turn out to be wrong for the case of the dictator imposes a drastic regime. And French regime and diet are the same, just as they are in Portuguese. So the only way we know what regime means, whether it's a diet in English or a ruling order as regime in the second sentence, is to get to the top of the sentence. So all this compositionality we did before we get to the subject has to sort of be undone or left to be determined. You have to say drastic regime. What does that mean? Well, we can't compose that yet. To be determined, and we wait till we get to the subject. We can also say something like in French, the storm cut off the road, or my car cut across the road. And we don't really know how to interpret the verb cut off or cut across, whether it's cut off or cut across, until we get to the subject. So the storm, when we say the storm cuts the road, we mean one thing. When we say the car cuts the road, we mean something else in French. And these are examples. There are many articles like this, but this is from Challenging the Principle of Compositionality, Interpreting Natural Language Texts. We also can have non-compositional discourse resolution of meaning. So the traffic light is damaged. What does that mean? Well, it can mean two things. Either the electronics of the traffic light are damaged, or the actual pole upon which the traffic light sits is damaged. But the words of the sentence composed in the same way simply don't give us enough information. The proper interpretation of something like the traffic light is damaged is non-compositional. At least not all the information is derived from the composition. If we say the traffic light is damaged, it is lying across the road, then we're referring to the pole. If we say the traffic light is damaged, the rain shorted it out, we're talking about its electronics. And these are things that the strict compositionality of meaning can't produce. We have to know something about the real world, and that means we're going to have some ambiguity. Um, so for today, and this is all that I have for today. We're simply trying to set the groundwork. We're trying to say that linguistic research is quite old. There's a lot that we don't understand about it, like we don't understand about the original inhabitants of Teotihuacan. And we need to do more research. But if we are bound by the sentence, if we are bound by form interpreting meaning rather than meaning interpreting form, we're going to have a problem. Now, one standard answer to all this is to compartmentalize and to say that syntax is one thing and discourse is another. And I understand that reasoning, but we're going to try to go beyond that in future talks, especially when we get into semiotics and the existential graphs of Peirce, and see how, for example, Peirce's theory of existential graphs can handle the syntactic patterns of Pitaha just as easily as they can handle the syntactic patterns of English, and how, since they're logically isomorphic, this can also be done in discourse representation theory. But at the same time, we're going to see that neither of those theories provides us with an adequate theory of discourse, and we need a lot more. And in particular, we're going to need that when we talk about cohesion and coherence. That is not only seen in the discourse, but also in lexical selection within sentences and verb forms. So there's a lot to this, and as we do field work, we find these strange things. You know, when I started work on Pitaha and asked the Pitaha how to say the word for milk, because I saw a woman nursing a baby, and then the baby pulled away and the milk was squirting out of her breast. And I said, how do you say milk? They said, Ibr, which I knew how to write that, because although it's rare, it's in the International Phonetic Alphabet, but did not occur in the International Phonetic Alphabet. In fact, then I went on to discover 2 more languages that had sounds not described in the International Phonetic Alphabet. And the phonetician Peter Ladefoged came down and worked with me for some time, and we published an article in Language called The Problem of Phonetic Rarities, in which we argued that these phonetic rarities don't fit into any particular theory, and we cannot modify theories so as to accommodate them. So theories are always going to have holes and exceptions in principle. And these are rare things. These are the things that field workers look for. Some of the rare things cause us to change our ways of thinking. Some of the rare things just cause us to scratch our head and move on. But as we study these rare things and things that don't fit particular theories, we are extending our understanding. We are extending the perimeters of what it means to be human. And in that sense, Boas and William James and other pragmatists were correct when they said that the particular is every bit as important as the general, and linguistics has to be concerned with both. And I suppose if you had to choose one, I find the particular to have more information in it than the general. So I'll stop and see if Miguel has any questions from anyone. Otherwise, what I want to say is that, as I said in the announcements, that every Tuesday, every other Tuesday, starting the 26th, I will come onto this Zoom channel and talk to the first 20 people that come on. I can't really account for more than 20 people, but I will do that. Thanks very much. This will be on YouTube, and you can find my email fairly easily by Googling me, and I'm happy to try to answer questions also by email. So thank you very much. And I'm going to go ahead and conclude the class at this time.